Hi. So I hope you had a nice break. We are ready to continue. So this time I won't be leaving the stage so soon because I will be moderating the next session and presenting you our next speaker. So Amy is one amazing woman. She's a freelance journalist, and during her 2-decade career, she worked for various media outlets like CBC News, BBC, Al Jazeera, Monocle, The Atlantic, and others. She also has a serious case of wanderlust, so she traveled all over Europe, Middle East, and Africa, all in a search of a good story, or sometimes a good place to surf. She's a Forbes Entrepreneur contributor, where she writes about entrepreneurial ecosystems and driving forces behind them. But most importantly for us today, she's a woman of many, many stories, and she will be sharing some of them with us today. So please help me welcome Amy Guttman.
So hopefully everyone has had enough caffeine to pay attention. Today I want to talk to you about how to make your story stand out. Now we all stand out. Everyone in this room stands out for a different reason. For most of you, it's for your concepts, your ideas, or how you execute them. For me, it's how I tell stories and what stories I actually choose to cover. And I'm known for kind of going off the beaten path. As an example of this, a PR person recently contacted me and invited me to the tiny African nation of Djibouti. I'll let you look that up on the map later. Why did she invite me? Well, she said, of all the people I know, you're the only person who would actually enjoy going to this place. And that just demonstrates why I stand out and what for. People who know me, people who know my work, know that I'm attracted to these places. I'm attracted to stories that haven't been covered yet, or a different take on stories that have. So of course I go to traditional places. Everyone has to. But I'm the one who looks under rocks. I'm the one who looks for the wider story. And often these are the stories that really pick up traction, those that are substantive and that tell a big picture story, or in fact, a trend, innovation, insight into a culture, or solve a problem. So actually, sometimes all you need is that one story to get out first. And then you'd be amazed how, if it's truly substantive, if it truly demonstrates one of these things in a really big way, that can be all you need. Because the thing is, here's a little secret. Journalists are lazy because we don't have a lot of time. So if we see a great story that someone else has already done, we're going to rip it off. We're going to take all the contacts and all the company names and all the people who have been mentioned, and we're going to call the same people. Maybe add in a few to mix it up. But essentially, all you sometimes need is that one story to get started and have the press calling. Today I'm going to tell you about 3 stories that demonstrate each of the things I mentioned. We're going to go to Iran, we're going to talk about pizza, and we're going to talk about moonshine. So the first story I want to share with you demonstrates a trend and a societal shift. I like to call it the democratization of pizza in Kenya. So how many people in this room see pizza as a privilege? Just raise your hand if you think pizza is something exclusive. Right. So, okay. Okay, so 2 people, but beyond that, most of us see pizza as something cheap, some kind of sort of comforting fast food, something for after a late night out. We don't see it as something really exclusive. So let's go to Kenya, because in Kenya, pizza has been exclusive, and that's what makes something as basic a food as pizza really interesting. And that's what actually has garnered this story a heavy click rate, which is fantastic for me. So in Kenya, until about 5 years ago, pizza was incredibly expensive. It was a food that only the wealthy could afford. And the average Kenyan only knew of pizza from the big screen, from American movies. And whenever they would pass the occasional pizza shop, they knew that it was something that only wealthy people and expats could afford. Why is that? Well, think about it. Cheese and olive oil aren't exactly indigenous to Kenya. So the cost of importing these items has traditionally been and remains pretty expensive. And because it was expensive, there was a very small consumer base consuming it. So there wasn't enough competition to drive prices down. Well, that's changed in the last 5 years. Why? Three different factors have come together at about the same time, and as we all know, timing is everything. So these factors start with the return of the Kenyan diaspora. Ever since about 5 years ago, there's been a big trend of the Kenyan diaspora returning from the West. They've been returning with their Western educations, they've been returning with their Western skills, and they've been returning with their sophisticated Western appetites for things like cupcakes and pizza. Decidedly unsophisticated food, I think we can all agree, but you get the point. So they've come back, and they want the comforts that they've come to expect. Next, we have all the European entrepreneurs, all the startup guys from Europe, particularly Northern Europe, who have left Europe during the recession because they found that their traditional sources of financing have all dried up. So they've come to Nairobi, which is sort of the capital of entrepreneurialism in East Africa, where they found it much easier to get their startup rolling. So they've come with their cravings for pizza. The last group is perhaps the most interesting one, because that's the lower classes of the Kenyan society who have slowly been rising up over the last 5 years. And why is that? Because Kenya has enjoyed incredible growth in its economy over the last 5 years, and it's set to continue for the next few years as well. So their lifestyles have been adapted because their wages have gone up. And of course, they're in on the pizza game. So as a result, we're seeing lots more pizza consumption. In fact, Domino's, if Ramon is in the room, he'll enjoy this story. Domino's has put 3 branches in Kenya just in the last 2 years. And actually, Domino's has a traditional model of pizza delivery, but they've had to change that to adapt to the local market, to make room for tables and chairs. Because the thing is, if a taxi driver in Kenya can afford to take his family out for a night of pizza, he wants to be seen doing so. It's a status symbol. The thing is, every good story is a great storyteller. That's what makes your story stand out. And nobody really wants to hear from corporate types like the PR person from Domino's, all respect to Domino's. So enter Ritesh Doshi. Ritesh Doshi is a dynamic entrepreneur. He gave up life in London as a banker to move to Nairobi and set up Naked Pizza, which is a franchise of healthy, high-end pizzas. He's been doing quite well, and he came to my attention through another article, thus my point. And he was really easy to contact, and he was a great talker, and he was able to put the whole picture into context for me. He was able to weave the tale of what was going on in Kenya, and the fact that the market size had changed so much and was so vast, and there were so many opportunities. He was able to talk about the challenges of setting up a business in Kenya, the realistic ones, and how he went there thinking he could have 15 branches, and now realized he'll probably max out at 5. He also talked about his employees, who before they came to work for him had never even tasted pizza. So Ritesh was really good for my story. Now on his own, good old Ritesh probably wouldn't have made it into Forbes for his own story. He's a good guy, but not enough to sustain a long piece. But if you couple him with the bigger story, using him to tell that story, weaving it through, it was like 2 pieces of a puzzle that fit perfectly together. He was the perfect person to tell the story. And that's something that you have to offer to a journalist. What does your startup, what is your concept, what does your idea say about a wider trend or even a societal shift? It's okay if there are other examples. In fact, that helps evidence your point. But are you in a position to perhaps pitch your story to the media as evidence of a trend or societal shift? Because if so, all of a sudden it takes on a whole new meaning. And it's less about a profile or something that kind of feels a bit thin and lacking in substance, and it becomes a really interesting story. Now, why did I choose Ritesh? Well, like I said, he was able to tell the story that I needed him to tell. He was responsive. And I think that's something that a lot of people, a lot of startups in particular, who don't have PR firms don't realize. You have to respond to the media. You have to engage with the media when they engage with you, even if you're not ready to engage with them. A simple no thank you, we'll be in touch when we're ready, is all it takes. You'd be amazed how many startups don't respond to emails. He was easy to work with. And he was flexible about timing and location. The thing is, freelance journalists are really short on time. We don't get travel budgets. So if we're in a foreign location, we're trying to squeeze in a lot of meetings in a really short amount of time. So Ritesh was very happy to meet me on a Monday night, 8 o'clock, in my hotel room over a dinner of one of his pizzas. He didn't even bat an eyelid. So when we meet an entrepreneur or a potential interview subject who's willing to go above and beyond to meet with us and doesn't care if it's early morning, late at night, weekend, whatever, then they capture our attention and we actually want to meet with them because they make it easy for us. So make it easy for a journalist. The last thing is that he was supplied materials really quickly. I needed pictures at the last minute that he didn't have. He went and got them, and it worked perfectly. So Ritesh made my job really easy. The second story I want to talk to you about is one that demonstrates triumph over failure and insight into a culture. So I call this one Tehran's Trailblazing Techpreneur. This is the story of a woman named Nazanin Danishvar. Now, people who are familiar with the tech scene may have heard of her because she's pretty much the face of the female entrepreneur in Tehran. And she's a real pioneer. So Nazanin, like many Iranian women, and a lot of people don't know this, graduated with a master's in IT. Not most, but many women graduate with second or third degrees in Iran, which is something we really don't hear about. She moved to Germany to get some practical experience in the tech field. And then on a trip home, she came up with an idea for a business. After seeing her mother struggle to carry grocery bags up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, she wondered whether there wouldn't be a really good business concept in a grocery delivery service in Tehran. So she went about starting up her business, except it was a good idea. It was too good an idea, and she wasn't prepared for it. She wasn't prepared for the media blitz, which even got picked up in The Guardian in the UK. And she really wasn't prepared for the consumer demand that followed after all this coverage. The most important bit is that the very thing that made her business a good idea is the very thing that caused its downfall. Because her whole plan was to try to offer an opportunity for consumers to avoid Tehran's notorious traffic. Because traffic in Tehran is a nightmare. It can take hours to go 1 mile. Except she hadn't thought about how her delivery trucks were going to avoid the same traffic. So you can imagine this was a huge problem. Ultimately, her idea failed. So she moved back to Berlin, got some more experience, and then on another trip home, came up with an idea. She thought, how about Groupon in Iran? People are always looking for something to do. There are no bars, obviously. And it raises an interesting point because the flip side to sanctions is that it creates all these local opportunities in the Iranian market because there is no YouTube, there is no Amazon, there is no Groupon, yet people want these things. It's a very sophisticated market. So she launched her Groupon site with her sister, and all was going well, except she came upon a different challenge altogether. When she would go to these meetings to meet with business owners to try to get them to come on board and allow her to sell their goods and services, they were mostly older men. They really didn't take her seriously. So every time she would step into one of their offices, they would say to her, "We like your idea, now let us speak to the manager." And she would say, "I am the manager." And they would say, "No, we mean the manager." And she would say, "I am the manager." And so this ensued. And obviously they would shut the door and basically tell her, "Come back when you have your manager." So being a clever woman, Nazanin recruited her father. And for every meeting after that, Nazanin's father would come along, she would introduce him as the manager, sit him down, tell him to be quiet, and she would do the deal. So this is a nice little anecdote to the story, which always helps because everybody likes a little color. Her company has been a huge success. It's gone from just her and her sister to 160 people on staff in 4 years, and it's had incredible growth rates. And she has been featured a number of times as a pioneer in Iran's tech industry. And she's now a mentor to other women and men in the industry. So why did I choose Nazanin? Because there are other female entrepreneurs in Tehran. Well, her success is interesting. Her success is what makes the story viable. Because obviously, nobody wants to hear about somebody who's failed and failed and failed and failed. But her success isn't what makes this story interesting. What makes her story interesting is the trial and error, her triumph over failure. And that's something I think a lot of startups and a lot of entrepreneurs dismiss and don't see the value in and try to hide. And as you all know, Silicon Valley, of all places, embraces failure. And Americans in particular love rooting for the underdog, especially when they overcome obstacles. The thing is, triumph over failure is really important because it helps impart your wisdom to other people. Nazanin's experience, not being prepared for the media, not being prepared knowing that that would then lead to consumer demand, and not being prepared for the obvious logistical challenges of what she was trying to do, seem like basic mistakes, but they're ones that maybe a lot of people haven't considered. And there's value in that. These days, when journalists are looking for lists, because these get high click rates, the top 10 startup myths, the top 10 mistakes never to make as an entrepreneur. So I'm sure all of you may have something to impart about this, may have something that other people can learn from. She also obviously really ticked big the curiosity factor. We learned a lot about Iran. We learned a lot about what it's like being a woman there and how the challenges are maybe a bit different than what we expect. And the last thing is she was very easy to reach. Now, one of the things I've really encountered problems with, as I mentioned earlier, is getting a response from certain communities of the startup arena. Surprisingly, Paris in particular is a very hard one to crack. I can't tell you how many entrepreneurs with great business ideas I've contacted in interviews multiple times and just gotten zero response. The thing is, in my view, I'll go back. If it's an interview I really want, I'll go back twice. That's fine. I might even go back a third time if I really want it. But once it becomes too difficult, we bail. Because again, it goes back to time. We don't have time. So the minute something becomes too difficult or someone becomes too difficult, we have tons of other options. So I'm just encouraging, I guess, to be easy to reach, be easy to work with, and look for your trial and error story. Now, the last story I want to share with you is about a moneymaker. And this is a story of a problem and a solution, but more importantly, the surprise bit here are the multiple winners involved. And that was a surprise to everyone involved in this story. So a few years ago, I was invited to the Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee, which is a beautiful area. And the invitation was to go visit a moonshine distillery, which sounded like a lot of fun, so it wasn't a tough sell. The owner of this moonshine distillery was a guy named Joe Baker, who was a former criminal lawyer. So he had kind of an interesting angle on his own, but not enough to build a whole story around. And the obvious angle would have been to talk about craft distilleries at that time, but that didn't seem terribly original either. So I dug around a bit. And I found out that until about 2008, 2009, the time the recession hit, moonshine in America was outlawed. Once the recession hit, people were losing jobs, companies were closing, and states were losing valuable income tax. Well, how to overcome this? Simple. Alcohol is very heavily taxed. So reverse this law, repeal the prohibition, and all of a sudden you have people in business, you have people buying alcohol, and you're generating tax revenue for local and federal accounts. So Joe Baker seized on this opportunity, wasted no time. In fact, I think he started his business the day after this became the new law. And his Ole Smoky Moonshine has been an incredible success. In fact, he sold it recently for millions of dollars. But the surprising thing about this story is not that Joe Baker was a huge success and now has millions of dollars. It's not that the government benefited as well. And it even goes beyond the fact that he's employed hundreds and hundreds of local people, from his production line to printing labels to driving the trucks that deliver all this moonshine. It even goes beyond that to the local farming community. The farmers who, when a storm happens, which is pretty common in the South, their fruit gets downed. it gets fallen to the ground, it gets bruised, and it's unsaleable. And they're stuck with all this rotten fruit, and they've lost money. Well, Joe Baker and his crew buy this fruit because they want to flavor their moonshine with it. So these are some surprise winners that nobody, not Joe Baker, not the government, had any idea would be beneficiaries. And the town has been a huge beneficiary because Ole Smoky is now popular across the United States in bars and restaurants. And so they're attracting thousands and thousands of visitors to that town every day. So the thing about this story that makes it a winner is that Joe Baker solves a problem. There are multiple beneficiaries of his business. There are the surprise winners. And most importantly, he was well prepared for the interview. He knew that I was going after substance. He came prepared with statistics, with figures, with important information, rather than just talking about moonshine as a trend and all the different flavors and things like that. So I would encourage you to be well prepared for any interview you do, because that's the other thing about the press. When we come to an interview, we're prepared. If you're not prepared, and we sense that, you lose credibility. And we cut that interview as short as possible, because it goes back to time. So if we think the interview's going nowhere, we're out of there. On the flip side, a great interview can go on for hours, and it can be the beginning of a wonderful relationship and lead to multiple stories. So what I want to leave you with today is the fact that all the people that I talked about, and most of the people that I try to interview, have one thing in common, and it's something that I possess as well. They're passionate. They're incredibly passionate about what they do, and that comes across, and it's infectious. And that's actually why I love working with startups, because you feel this incredible energy. Everybody feels really optimistic and like they can change the world with their product or service. So what I would encourage you to do is find your energy, tap into your passion, find your story, and pitch a journalist. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, so we have time for some questions. So since you're a media consultant and work with startups, let's say we have a startup that is at the beginning of its journey and doesn't have funds for a PR company and has a story. How do they choose a journalist to pitch, a publication to pitch?
Well, these days it's very easy because everybody's online. And there really is an outlet or publication for everybody. As everybody knows, it's quite niche now, as well as broad. And you can start doing that by using Twitter. So you put in the keywords, see who comes up, and journalists, see who comes up, start following them. See what kinds of stories that they're covering. And even as a journalist, what I often do when I think about a story that I want to pitch, I sort of put the title in the middle of a circle, and then outside that circle, I make a wheel and spokes. And I think about all the different types of publications that might be interested in it. So it could be a sports story, but it could be a sports technology story. So maybe Wired would be interested in it, but maybe Runner's Magazine would be interested in it as well. So it's about thinking more broadly. And maybe it's a story that the Wall Street Journal would be interested in if it really is innovative.
So do any of you have a question? Do we have a question for the audience? Just raise your hand. We have mics everywhere. Okay, so it's my turn again. So let's get back to Joe from Ole Smoky. You said that he came well prepared for the interview, and that's what made the difference in his story. How do you prepare? What can you expect when you go to the interview with the journalist?
So the first thing you should do when you agree to an interview with a journalist is check them out. They've done their homework on you. You do your homework on them. See what kind of articles they've done. See whether they like a contentious style, because that's something you really need to be prepared for. See whether they do softball stories. That'll be a bit easier. That'll tell you their angle. People who do interviews with me for Forbes know that I cover entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. They know that that's my angle, unless I've said otherwise. And actually, in the case of Ritesh, he had come to the interview having researched all about me and started a conversation about something else that I do, saying how much he felt that resonated with him, which kicked off, a really great conversation and just kind of broke the ice in a great way.
So actually what he started is building a relationship with you, which is probably important later on, right?
It is. I think, as everyone knows, the world has become a lot less formal, and that includes relationships, and you all know that. But particularly when it comes to journalists, we all need each other much more these days, and we're all collaborating much more. And so someone like Ritesh, sitting down for the interview and warming things up, which I don't think was intentional, I think it was sincere, but genuinely warming things up by connecting with me about something we had in common, in places that we've both lived, really ignited a conversation. And that interview went on for 3 hours. And in fact, he's coming to London in July and wants to get together, and it's a friendship now. But in the case of Joe Baker, because he was great to talk to, hosted a fabulous barbecue with loads of moonshine one of the nights that we were there, and really nurtured that relationship. It's a story I covered 3 years ago. But last December, I was really desperate for a story for Forbes before the Christmas break. And I called Joe and said, hey, can we just refresh that interview? Because I need to just jam something into Forbes. And sure enough, 3 years later, he got coverage again. And there was no way for him to know when we first met where I would wind up. And I think that's really important to remember too. You don't know where people are going to land. And so it's a good investment no matter what happens.
Okay, so we are out of the time, but Amy is here. Oh, you have a question. Please ask. Sorry.
Hi, Amy. Long time no see. Yeah, I have a question. So, what would be your favorite question to ask any startup?
Oh, gosh.
I know.
I suppose it's, what makes you interesting? What makes you or your product interesting? And really, that's the first benchmark. If you can't tell me or an investor what makes you or your product or service interesting, then I think you have a bigger question to answer.
Any more questions? Please.
Hi, yes. For startups, it's very important that you get the story that you're very passionate across the way that you want to tell it. And as you say, the journalists also have their own perspective. So what do you do if your story is taken out of the context?
Well, hopefully, I think that does happen, but hopefully less frequently. It's an interesting one because actually I've been wrestling with a very popular Berlin startup that's in the radio audio space. I won't mention it, but it has something to do with clouds. And they've become incredibly difficult and controlling. And I'm in Berlin next Wednesday, wanted to meet with them. I'm out, I'm done, because it's just been too difficult. So I think you have to be careful and to couch your message in a way that works but doesn't come across as controlling, because the minute someone senses that, they get suspicious that you have something to hide or that you're trying to manipulate too much. I think as long as you stay on message, it'll work.
Okay, so we don't have any more time for questions, but Amy is here, so feel free to approach her, and you have her Twitter handle there, so feel free to tweet her, and maybe even to picture her your story. You never know. So thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Big round of applause again for Amy, please.
Sorry.
Oh, this is awkward.